For the longest time, perhaps even since the days of Charles Sheldon's classic book, In His Steps, the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" has been an ethical policy for millions of believers. Unbeknownst to most of these believers, however, what would Jesus do is actually bad ethical policy. One of my greatest fears for Christians today is they're so gullible. If something sounds spiritual, then thousands upon thousands of believers will immediately accept it, and anyone who questions it will quickly be condemned as unspiritual. For example, if someone says they don't like the church growth movement, they're going to be accused of an us for and no more kind of policy. If someone's opposed to the social gospel, well, they'll be accused of not caring for shoeless children in faraway places. And if someone doesn't believe that God is giving direct messages to believers around the world, well, they'll be accused of rejecting the third person of the Trinity. And having had some experience with each one of these, I know that some people are going to reject outright my rejection of a "what would Jesus do" ethic. But should we do what Jesus would do? Can we do what Jesus would do? Do we know what Jesus would do? Are we instructed to do what Jesus would do? You know, even before Twitter, we had what I'll just call it Twitter theology. Twitter theology is a spiritual statement that's easy to post and to repost, to like it and to share it, to put it into a sound bite, put it out on the church marquee. Most of this Twitter theology really needs to be thoroughly questioned. In fact, I think we should question Twitter theology as much as, maybe even more than, we question the sermons we hear, and the Christian books we read, and the contemporary Christian music we listen to. What would Jesus do? It's really pre-Twitter era Twitter theology. And I want to question it. For at least two reasons. I don't think Jesus can be the criterion for Christian living. First of all, you see, Jesus lived under the law. What would Jesus do for breakfast? Well, biblically, the only time we even see him eating breakfast, he's eating fish. Personally, I'm not too eager to do what Jesus would do for breakfast. Though we only have one incident in Scripture in which Jesus is actually eating breakfast, we know that Jesus wouldn't have bacon for breakfast. Sausage biscuits? They're out too. What would Jesus do for lunch? I enjoy going down to my favorite burger joint, having a cheeseburger. Jesus, however, he kept kosher. Not only will he not eat a cheeseburger, he likely won't even choose to go down to the burger joint. No doubt, for the same reason, my Tex-Mex supper isn't going to be what Jesus would do either. So I say I would do what Jesus would do, but I wouldn't do it at breakfast. I wouldn't do it at lunch, and I wouldn't do it at dinner. What about on the Sabbath? A typical Sabbath day will find me mowing the lawn and doing some chores around the house, often running to town, completing some errands, maybe getting the family in the car to go off for a picnic, or a shopping venture, or a movie, or a play, or a concert. For those under the law, all this is prohibited. So I don't do what Jesus would do at mealtime. I don't do what Jesus would do on the Sabbath. Well, of course, as a modern-day Christian, though, I would find ways to explain that Jesus, if he were living today, well, he'd behave differently than he actually behaved in the day in which he lived. And you know, it's not uncommon. I'd likely be very selective in my biblical interpretation, so that, quite conveniently, Jesus ended up behaving just the way I wanted him to behave. If Jesus were here today, would he say, "The poor you have with you always"? If Jesus were here today, would he make the entire focus of his ministry to be that little nation of Israel? If Jesus were here today, would he overturn the sales booth out in the church foyer, snapping a whip on the back of the money changers? Would Jesus were here today, would he tell us to dust off our shoes if someone rejects the gospel message? You know, the bottom line is that we fail, and when we fail to rightly divide the word of truth, we just create this mambo-jambo kind of theology that has absolutely no consistency. I think one of the reasons that young people so quickly leave the church when they leave home, well, it's because the church and its WWJD ethic just really lacks any kind of a logical sense. There's no consistency to it. There's an easy way to bring Scripture together, and to bring it together in perfect harmony. The problem is we'd have to leave many of our closely held doctrines of modern religious wisdom. We'd just have to leave them behind. In fact, the Apostle Paul gives us an instruction that spares us from the inconsistencies of this "what would Jesus do" theology. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." Perhaps we ought to start wearing a bracelet that says, WWPD. What would Paul do? You see, Pauline theology is built for Christians living in an age of grace. And it avoids the problem of, what would Jesus do? I know some of you are thinking, well, why not just cut out the middleman and imitate Christ? But that fails to take into account the fact that Paul, as the apostle for this age, has a unique access to Jesus Christ. He consistently claims that he received direct revelation from the risen Lord that's applicable to our lives today. There's another reason I don't think WWJD works, and that's because Jesus cannot be self-interpreted. WWJD becomes bad ethical policy because, well, honestly, we just have to make so much stuff up. What would Jesus do about the biomedical issues that we face today in our society? What would Jesus think about Federal Reserve policy? How would Jesus respond to an overloaded email box? What would Jesus do if the waiter got his order wrong? Where would Jesus live if he had a choice between Albuquerque and Albania? You know, all these questions require us to make some assumptions, and these assumptions are very likely to be nothing more than, well, than our preference masquerading as God's will. The problem is that Jesus isn't open to self-interpretation. We can't just guess what Jesus would do or say or think. For that matter, I can't even guess what you would do or say or think. Why do we want to create an ethic that requires the self-interpretation of Jesus? In fact, have you ever noticed that when people use the WWJD approach to ethical problems, they often land on the liberal side of the argument? No, the conservative position has clear scripture reference, black and white, there it is. But when someone wants to go a different direction than the clear teaching of Scripture, well, they pull out the WWJD card. Have you ever heard that Jesus wouldn't support capital punishment, but he would support gay marriage? Sure is convenient just to be able to make up what Jesus wouldn't do and what Jesus would do, so we can use Jesus then to support our problem. My seminary Old Testament survey book, it was by LaSword, Hubbard, and Bush. It had this to say about the way that Jesus interpreted the Old Testament. Compared to the viewpoint of most of his Jewish contemporaries, Christ's approach to the Old Testament was dynamic, not static. He looked upon the Old Testament not as a catalog of fixed principles regulating religious conduct, but as the inspired and authoritative record of God's activity in history. An activity which presses towards its denouement in His coming kingdom. As Jesus' words are spirit and life, so the Old Testament, when viewed with His insights, becomes a guide to life. By determining what Jesus would do with Old Testament interpretation, He would interpret it in a dynamic, not a static manner. The authors could then release themselves from a literal interpretation of the Hebrew text. And they did. Writing about Genesis chapters 1 through 11, they said it's not history in the modern sense. Rather, it conveys theological truths portrayed in a largely symbolic and pictorial literary genre. They further said that since Adam means mankind and Eve is she who gives life, surely when the author of a story names the principal characters mankind and life, something's conveyed about the degree of literalness intended. How does one build an Old Testament interpretation that all but denies the literal existence of a man and a woman named Adam and Eve? How does one deny a 6-day creation or a worldwide flood? It's easy. All you need to do is self-interpret Jesus. Then have that self-interpreted Jesus interpret the Hebrew text the way you would want it to read. And you've got a beautiful tool for your own theological agenda. What would Jesus do? Well, I'm not sure I know. I know some things that He did, but I can't just use that as an anecdotal evidence for some personal pet peeve. I know some things He did that, I can't do them. I know some things that He did that because I'm not under the law, I'm not obligated to do. So at its very best, WWJD is really just an exercise in theological imagination. I better not use WWJD for a personal ethic. What I should do is be diligent to present myself approved to God. A workman who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. I'm Dr. Randy White.